High on Alaska's rugged coastline, a thriving settlement once bustled with fishermen, loggers, and families carving out a life against the wild. Then, without warning, the place was left to the wind and sea, cabins abandoned, nets still hanging, tools scattered as though their owners had fled mid-task. Whispers spread of hunters dragged into the trees, of guttural roars echoing through the valley at night. Tracks larger than any man's wound through the mud, leading nowhere. This wasn't disaster, and it wasn't war. Something out there was hunting them, and its legend became the shadow that erased Port Chatham forever. The shoreline stretched endlessly, a jagged wound where ocean met land, battered by waves that carried more than just salt. Mist clung to the cliffs like a shroud, twisting through the trees and drowning sound in its damp silence. Locals swore the place felt heavier than air itself, as though every gust of wind carried whispers too old for human ears. It wasn't just coastline, it was a boundary, and something waited just beyond it. Fishing boats drifted in cautiously, their captains steering with eyes fixed on the tree line. Nets often came back torn, shredded as though claws had raked through them. The ocean was dangerous, but it was the land that frightened them more. Fishermen docked quickly, worked fast, and left before the sun dropped. None wanted to be caught when the shadows stretched across the rocks. Children who grew up nearby were taught never to wander past the tide line. Their elders told stories of shapes moving in the fog, massive and silent, keeping pace just out of sight. Sometimes footprints appeared in the sand, so large they swallowed the prints of boots and deer alike. The waves erased them quickly, but not before eyes caught the proof. Something walked here that did not belong. The cliffs above bore scars, long grooves cut into stone that storms alone could not carve. Some swore they looked like claw marks, gouged deep and angled as though something massive had clambered its way down. Others dismissed them as erosion, the work of wind and waves, but at night, when the tide pulled back, the air carried the sound of stone grinding, like something returning to its resting place. Hunters followed trails inland and came back pale, carrying no game. Their voices low and clipped, they spoke of silence too thick, of forest paths where no bird sang and no squirrel moved. Even the streams seemed muted, as if the entire wilderness held its breath. More than once, a hunting dog refused to move forward, growling at nothing visible, teeth bared against the unseen. The coastline wasn't abandoned out of choice. It was abandoned out of necessity. Families once tried to build there, drawn by rich waters and fertile soil. Cabins went up, smoke curled from chimneys, and laughter briefly echoed against the waves. But one by one the homes emptied, tools left behind, doors ajar, as though people had fled in haste. What drove them out was never written, only whispered. Travelers who ventured there later found strange signs: shattered lanterns, blankets torn to ribbons, fire pits still warm with no one around them, livestock pens broken apart as though smashed from above, not by man or weather, chickens, goats, even dogs vanished overnight, leaving no trace but the reek of iron in the air. The ocean seemed safer, even with storms, than the land that devoured the living. Those who lingered long enough reported noises carried on the wind, not the crash of waves, nor the calls of seabirds, but guttural sounds too deep to name. Some described them as growls, others as words spoken in a language older than man. Whatever the truth, the sound froze marrow and stiffened spines, forcing even the bravest to flee back to their boats. The forest pressed close to the coast, a dark wall of green where daylight rarely penetrated. Branches twisted overhead, knitting together like the ribs of a great beast. The deeper one walked, the colder the air became. As though the trees themselves leached warmth away, hunters often marked their paths with rope or chalk. Yet more than once, they returned to find their markings gone, replaced with scratches no man could claim. At low tide, caves revealed themselves along the rock face, yawning like open mouths. No torchlight ever pierced their depths, swallowed instantly by darkness that seemed alive. Bones sometimes washed out with the tide, deer, bears, and occasionally something too large, too human-like, for comfort. Locals avoided the caves, calling them gateways, places where the world above and below bled together. Fishermen told of shadows pacing the bluffs at dusk, tall and heavy, moving against the last light of day. They vanished when confronted. leaving only silence behind. Some men fired rifles into the tree line, but no cries came, only echoes that seemed to mock them. Ammunition felt useless, the act itself more for courage than survival. During storms, the coastline came alive with more than thunder. Amidst the howling wind, there came roars that shook windows and rattled bones. They were never in rhythm with thunder, never natural. Each roar seemed closer than the last, and by dawn, trees near the cabins bore fresh wounds, bark peeled away in wide swaths as though peeled by massive claws. The animals sensed it most. Horses balked at approaching the coast, stamping and sweating as if predators pressed near. Dogs whined constantly, tails tucked, refusing to eat or rest until taken far inland. Even the gulls seemed wary, circling high overhead but never daring to land near the tree line. It was as if every living thing knew the place was claimed by something greater. Men who tried to map the area never succeeded. Compasses spun, refusing to settle. Trails led back to where they began. Even when carefully measured, campers swore that cabins shifted during the night, that the shoreline itself twisted into new shapes. Whether it was tricks of fog or something manipulating the land, no one could say, but maps never held true. And explorers abandoned them quickly. The water itself seemed tainted near shore. Fish bled black when caught too close to land, their flesh tasting of metal and rot. Nets tangled with bones and seaweed, torn apart as though something had ripped through them from below. The sea should have been a source of life, but instead it mirrored the forest's hunger, taking more than it ever gave back. Whispers of giants spread quickly. Some spoke of creatures that moved between the ocean and the mountains, unseen by day but active at dusk. Their footprints appeared in the sand, vanishing by morning tide. Sometimes a handprint appeared on cabin walls, far too high and far too large for any man. Each mark felt like a warning left in plain sight, daring humans to remain. The coast grew quieter as word spread. Fewer boats docked, fewer cabins stood by winter. The settlement was a ghost. Only the sea crashing against cliffs and the forest pressing closer each year. Yet travelers swore the place was never empty. Eyes watched from the tree line, steps echoed in the fog, and the sense of being unwelcome never left. Explorers who returned told stories of stone piles left near campfires, stacked carefully as though marking territory. Sometimes feathers, bones, and carved sticks lay arranged in strange patterns at doorsteps. They felt like warnings, messages left by something intelligent enough to understand trespass. Whether men or monsters left them, none could say. But the effect was the same: fear. Winter snow revealed more than mud or grass ever could. Tracks appeared overnight, massive and unbroken, weaving between cabins and vanishing into the sea. The stride length dwarfed even the tallest man, leaving no doubt about the creature's size. Attempts to follow ended quickly, as hunters found themselves circling back to their starting point, as though the land itself refused to give up its secrets. Survivors whispered about disappearances. A man would walk into the woods for firewood and never return. Children vanished from cabins, despite locked doors and watchful parents. Entire hunting parties left in search of game and returned only as stories whispered in taverns. Each disappearance left fewer willing to settle, until the coastline itself became synonymous with loss. By spring, silence ruled. No smoke rose from chimneys. No laughter echoed across the waves. Cabins sagged under snow, roofs collapsing without care. Yet the land did not feel abandoned. It felt patient. Travelers swore the silence pressed against them, as though the forest held its breath, waiting for them to leave so it could exhale once more. The ocean mirrored that silence. Waves rolled in soft, muted, dragging seaweed and bones to shore. Even storms seemed hushed, their rage swallowed before it reached the cliffs. Sailors called it the quietest stretch of sea they had ever known, but none took comfort in it. Quiet was not safety, quiet was warning. Legends took root in nearby towns. Fishermen gathered in taverns, spinning tales of massive figures glimpsed in the fog, of eyes glowing faintly in torchlight. Some dismissed them as drunken fantasies, yet the fear in their voices betrayed belief. Tales of monsters traveling the coastline spread, each more terrifying than the last. Decades passed, and the coast grew wild again. Moss claimed cabins, vines swallowed fences, and the sea eroded docks into splinters. But the stories never left. Travelers still avoided the place, and even the bravest hunters admitted the woods grew too still when they neared the cliffs. It was as though the land itself remembered, unwilling to let its secrets go. Today, the place looks ordinary at first glance. A rocky shoreline, a silent forest, a stretch of sea no different from the rest of Alaska. But those who linger swear the air feels wrong. The silence weighs heavier, and if you stay long enough, if you listen too closely, you might hear something in the fog, something massive, breathing, waiting just beyond the tide. The bay stretched wide and empty, its waters pulling back with the tide until the sand glistened like a mirror under the dim light. Driftwood lay scattered across the shore, tangled with seaweed and broken shells, as though the ocean had coughed up remnants it wanted no part of. The silence here was deeper than elsewhere, carrying no cries of gulls, no splash of fish. It was a silence that pressed heavy, daring intruders to step further. Villagers seldom came, but when they did, they kept to the shallows, never venturing past the line of blackened rocks. Those rocks, they said, marked the edge of something older than the sea. They whispered of nights when the sand bore impressions too large to belong to man or beast. In the morning, the tide erased them, leaving no evidence except for the memories of those who had seen. The first footprints were noticed by a fisherman, trudging along the beach at dawn. They sank deep, as if pressed by something impossibly heavy. The shape was roughly human, but stretched, each step twice the length of his stride. He dropped his basket and fled, muttering that the ocean had spat out something that did not belong on land. Few believed him, until more saw the same. Weeks passed, and others found the marks etched into the sand, always at night, always gone by day. They curved along the shoreline, vanishing into the water, as though something walked freely between sea and land. Some swore the prints glowed faintly under the moon, edges sharp even when the wind should have smoothed them away. No one dared follow the trail. Stories grew with each sighting. Children were warned never to play along the bay, not because of tides or currents, but because of what might follow their tracks. Parents barred doors at night, muttering prayers in languages older than the churches they built. Fear of the unseen became stronger than storms, shaping lives more than weather ever could. Hunters grew curious, though, and curiosity is dangerous. They traced the prints by lantern light, watching the impressions stretch toward the woods. The ground trembled faintly beneath each step, as though echoing a weight still present in memory. When they reached the tree line, the trail vanished, swallowed by roots and shadows. The hunters returned pale, insisting the forest itself had erased what it didn't want them to see. One night, a storm drove boats inland, and men sheltered near the bay. As lightning lit the sand, they glimpsed fresh tracks forming before their eyes. No figure accompanied them, only depressions sinking as though by invisible feet. The men bolted without gathering their supplies, their oaths forgotten in the roar of rain. They never spoke of what they had witnessed, but their silence said enough. The footprints came in patterns, too deliberate to be random. They circled driftwood piles, paused near tidal pools, and sometimes spread into 2 or 3 sets before merging again. Whatever left them was not wandering aimlessly. It was searching, studying, perhaps even playing. The thought chilled every soul who dared picture it. This was not the path of an animal. It was the intent of something with purpose. Fishermen claimed their nets snagged on more than rock when cast near the bay. They pulled up strands of hair, thick and coarse, longer than any animal should grow. The strands glistened like wet rope, snapping with unnatural strength when pulled. Some swore the footprints and the hair were connected. When the tide was lowest, bones sometimes surfaced in the sand, not fish bones, but larger. Ribs, femurs, skulls cracked as though crushed. They were never intact, always fragmented, as though chewed upon. The prints often appeared nearby, circling the remains as though marking territory. No one dared to touch the bones, letting the sea reclaim them instead. It was better not to interfere. Travelers who camped by the bay returned with wild eyes, muttering of voices whispering outside their tents. They described footsteps pacing back and forth, stopping just short of fabric walls. In the morning, they found the sand pressed with enormous tracks, circling their camp like a predator toying with prey. Some never returned at all, their abandoned gear found buried in shallow pits of sand. Children dared each other to venture out by moonlight, but those who did often came home changed. One boy spoke of watching the water swell as if something massive rose beneath. Another girl screamed for hours, unable to explain what she had seen, except to say that eyes had stared at her from far too low in the surf. Their parents forbade such games afterward, but curiosity lingered in every young heart. Merchants traveling through the area made their own records, sketching the prints and comparing them to known animals. None matched. The length, the depth, the strange curve of the toes. It was unlike anything in their books. Some speculated giant apes, others sea creatures dragging themselves ashore. But none could explain the intelligence the trails suggested. These weren't beasts. They were walkers. The elders grew more restless, insisting the bay was cursed ground. They spoke of times before maps, when men vanished from the coastline in droves. They recalled tales of shapes moving in fog, of giant shadows dragging people into the waves. The footprints, they said, were not new. They were reminders of something that had always claimed the bay, waiting for the foolish to forget. Sailors grew to fear docking there. Even in daylight, the place unnerved them. The sand seemed too soft, too ready to swallow. Their boots left marks that looked fragile beside the massive prints. Some joked grimly that the bay compared each visitor to decide who would stay, and no one wanted to be the one chosen. One winter, snow blanketed the bay, revealing more than sand ever could. The prints cut through the drifts, impossibly deep, each stride measured and precise. Some led directly to abandoned huts near the tree line. The snow showed no signs of return. Whatever entered had not come back out. Those huts collapsed under frost, never lived in again. Travelers who slept too near the shore spoke of dreams not their own. They saw the bay from beneath the water, staring up through waves at the moon. They felt heavy limbs dragging across the sand, cold lungs pulling in brine. When they awoke, the footprints surrounded their sleeping place, as though something had stood watching while they dreamed. The animals avoided the area entirely. No fox tracks, no deer trails, no bear prints ever touched the sand where the strange impressions lay. It was as though the creatures of the land acknowledged what men refused to admit, that the bay did not belong to them. It had already been claimed by something else. Explorers who braved the caves nearby often found prints leading inside, pressed into the wet stone. No one ever ventured deep enough to follow. The echoes that emerged from within were enough to send them fleeing, low rumblings that did not belong to any man. The caves were sealed in memory, though not in stone. At times the prints vanished mid-stride, as if the creature had simply lifted into the air. Other times they appeared from nowhere, beginning in the middle of the sand with no approach. These breaks unnerved people more than full trails ever did. They suggested something not bound by the laws of movement as men understood them. During nights when the moon was red with eclipse, the footprints multiplied, trails crisscrossed the sand in wild patterns, weaving together until the beach looked like a map. Some claim they shifted in the dark, fresh impressions forming even as eyes watched. No one lingered long enough to see where they led, for fear of following them too far. The bay grew infamous, a place mentioned in hushed tones in taverns and villages. Men dared one another to walk its edge, but most refused. It wasn't just the prints that frightened them, it was the knowledge that whatever left them had never been seen in full. To glimpse only its shadow, its mark, was to admit that something greater still prowled unseen. Even today, the shoreline lies quiet, sand stretching wide with the tide. But when the wind drops and the fog clings low, faint depressions reappear. They may vanish with the morning sun, but their memory endures, etched into the minds of those who dared look. The bay is no longer just a place, it is a reminder, a warning carved into the earth. And though the waves erase the marks each day, the truth remains: something walks there, something vast, something patient, something that does not need to be seen to be remembered. The footprints are only fragments, but they are enough. For each step pressed into the sand is proof that the bay is not empty, and it never has been. The night in Port Chatham began with a stillness so thick it felt unnatural. No owls called from the forest. No dogs barked in the distance. Even the tide seemed hesitant, its waves rolling in quieter than usual, as though the sea itself were holding its breath. Men in their cabins whispered that something was off, but no one dared step outside. The dark pressed close, heavier than the cold. Lanterns flickered in narrow windows, their glow barely pushing against the fog rolling in from the bay. The mist carried with it the stink of fish and rot, sharper than usual, sharp enough to sting the nose. Children stirred uneasily in their sleep, muttering at dreams they could not explain. Mothers hushed them, but their own eyes darted to the door with unease. The air had weight, pressing on lungs with each breath. Hunters on watch, perched near the edge of the settlement, shifted nervously. The woods behind them were endless, a wall of black timber rising high into the sky. Every crack of a branch sent nerves twitching, though no wind stirred to explain the noise. They held rifles steady, but their hands trembled just enough to betray their fear. They knew silence was worse than sound. Then it came, a deep rumble, so low it seemed to rise from the ground itself. At first they thought it was thunder rolling across distant mountains, but there were no clouds above, no storm brewing. The sound continued, stretching, climbing in pitch, until it rattled the ribs of every man. One hunter dropped to his knees, clutching his chest as though his heart would break. The roar broke free and full, shaking the air with a force beyond comprehension. It wasn't the cry of a bear, nor the howl of a wolf. It was layered, human and inhuman, sharp and guttural, as though multiple voices screamed as one. Windows rattled, walls shook, and tools fell from hooks. Every creature that heard it knew instantly, it was not of this world. Cattle panicked, breaking their tethers, charging blindly into the night. Horses reared in their stalls, slamming hooves against wooden beams until they bled. Dogs whined and bolted, tails tucked, refusing to return even when called. The animals knew what the people could not admit aloud. The roar did not belong to prey or predator. It belonged to something that ruled. Children woke screaming, their small voices drowned beneath the echo that rolled across the valley. Some swore they saw shadows outside their windows, tall and broad, moving just beyond the fog. Mothers pulled them into their arms, whispering prayers too old for churches, their words trembling as badly as their hands. Fathers barred the doors, though they knew wood and nails were nothing against what moved outside. The hunters who had been on watch returned pale, eyes wide and hollow. They said the trees had bent as the sound rolled through them, their branches shivering like leaves in a storm. The roar had come from everywhere and nowhere at once, impossible to pinpoint. They felt watched from all sides, though no figure revealed itself. Fear clung to them like frost. Some insisted it was a warning, a claim laid bare across the land. Others believed it was the voice of something ancient, roused by trespassers building homes where they were not welcome. Whatever it was, no one doubted its meaning. They were not safe, not even within their walls. The roar had cracked the illusion of control. The echoes lingered long after the sound ended, threading through the valley like a curse. Birds took flight in massive flocks, blotting the moon as they fled. The forest creaked as though it groaned in pain, its branches snapping in unnatural rhythm. Even the sea responded, waves crashing harder against the rocks, their spray lashing high into the air. The entire land seemed to shudder in response. Men gathered in the largest cabin, their faces pale, rifles clutched tightly. Some argued it was a bear, massive and enraged. Others shook their heads violently, saying no creature of flesh could produce such a sound. They argued until voices cracked, but none dared suggest leaving the settlement. To step outside was to risk hearing that roar again, closer. The sound returned once more, sharper this time, rattling nails from their beams. It surged higher, splitting into tones that seemed to claw at the ears. Some men fell to the ground, hands pressed to their heads as blood trickled from their noses. Others stood frozen, unable to move as the force pressed against their bodies. It wasn't just sound, it was power made voice. Cabins shook on their foundations, and one collapsed entirely, timbers snapping like twigs. The family inside bolted into the fog, their screams fading into silence. When the villagers followed with lanterns, They found no trace, no bodies, no tracks, only footprints far too large, pressed into the damp earth around the ruins. The prince led into the forest and ended abruptly. The roar seemed to laugh then, rolling with a sickening rise and fall that mimicked amusement. It was no longer simply noise. It had intent. It knew fear was spreading, and it fed on it. The men realized with dawning horror that this wasn't the cry of a creature defending itself. This was a predator taunting prey already caught in its grasp. Fires were lit in desperation, flames rising high to pierce the fog. The villagers huddled together, praying that light would keep the darkness at bay. But the roar only grew louder, circling them, rising first from the woods, then from the bay, then from the mountains. It was everywhere at once, closing in tighter with every breath. The elders whispered of old stories, legends of beings that walked between worlds, neither man nor beast. They claimed such roars were the voices of giants cursed to wander forever, taking vengeance on those who crossed their paths. No one laughed at such tales now. The roar made believers of them all. Hours passed, yet no sleep came. Every crack of timber, every groan of the wind felt like a prelude to another outburst. Children wept until exhaustion silenced them. Men sat with rifles across their knees, eyes wide, fingers trembling on triggers. The village was awake as one, bound by fear of the next strike. When dawn finally broke, it was gray and sickly, the fog lingering thicker than usual. The roar did not return, but its absence was not comfort. The silence that followed was worse, heavy with promise. Everyone knew it was not over. The night had been only the beginning of whatever hunted them. That day, hunters scouted the edges of the forest. They found trees ripped open, bark shredded as though by massive claws, rocks overturned, some weighing hundreds of pounds, tossed aside like pebbles. The prints were there too, deep in the soil, each larger than a man's chest. The hunters returned shaken, swearing they would never set foot there again. Fishermen found the shoreline disrupted as well, nets torn to ribbons, boats cracked against the rocks. The sand bore the same massive impressions, leading into the waves. The roar had not been confined to the forest. It had come from the sea as well. Whatever stalked them moved freely between both worlds. That evening, as lanterns were lit once more, the villagers gathered to decide their fate. Some demanded they abandon Port Chatham entirely, leave before night fell again. Others insisted they stay, arguing that fear could not dictate their lives, but no decision was reached. They sat in silence, waiting, every man listening for the first hint of sound. The roar returned once more, softer this time, almost gentle. But its quiet was worse, like a whisper promising violence. It slid into their ears, into their bones, settling where fear never left. The villagers clutched their children tighter, their eyes darting wildly to the shadows. The sound was not just a roar anymore. It was a presence that would not let them go. The dogs never came back. The cattle fled into the woods and were never found. The hunters refused to stand watch, leaving the settlement blind. Everyone knew their community was crumbling, and still the roar lingered, echoing across the valley whenever silence threatened to return. It became part of their nights, a reminder of what stalked them. Soon, people began to vanish. A hunter here, a fisherman there. Sometimes they screamed first, sometimes they did not. But every disappearance was marked by the same thing, the echo of that roar, rolling through the night like thunder from nowhere. It no longer announced itself. It claimed its victims silently, leaving only sound in its wake. The roar was not merely noise, it was a curse, a claim, a weapon. It broke their resolve, shattered their unity, hollowed them from within. And by the time the villagers realized it, it was too late. The sound had already become their end. Even now, long after Port Chatham was abandoned, travelers claim to hear it on quiet nights. When fog rolls in from the bay and the forest sways without wind, a roar splits the air, low, guttural, rising into a scream that shakes the soul. Those who hear it swear they are being warned, but of what, none can say. The land remembers. The shoreline, the trees, the cabins sinking into moss, they all echo with the memory of that sound, for the roar was not bound to the creature alone. It was bound to the place, to the fear it inspired. And anyone who dares walk Port Chatham's soil knows the truth. The night is never truly silent. Because somewhere in the dark, the roar waits, patient, hungry, promising that no matter how far the world moves on, its voice will always rise again to shatter the night. The hunters of Port Chatham were men hardened by wilderness, accustomed to storms, wolves, and the silence of long winters. They carried rifles with confidence and wore their knives like extensions of their hands. To them, the forest was not an enemy but a test, a place that rewarded skill and punished arrogance. Yet when the disappearances began, even these men faltered. It started with two brothers, seasoned trappers, who knew every ridge and stream within miles. They set out one morning to check their lines, promising to return before dusk. Their dogs returned instead, whining and trembling, their harnesses torn as though by claws. The brothers were never seen again, their traps left untouched in the forest. At first, villagers assumed a bear had taken them, a tragedy but not unheard of. Yet no signs of struggle were found. No blood, no torn clothing, only deep impressions in the soil, too wide to belong to any animal they knew. The prints led into the hills, then vanished on solid rock, as if whatever left them had taken flight. Another hunter vanished weeks later, this one older. A man respected for his skill and his survival. His absence was more than loss. It was warning. He had boasted often that no creature could catch him unaware. His rifle was found propped against a tree, loaded and ready. But he was gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. By then, fear had seeped into the bones of the settlement. Families begged their men not to enter the woods, but the hunters refused to stay behind. Hunting was not a choice. It was survival. Each trip into the forest became a gamble, each return a fragile relief, and each loss deepened the silence that haunted the village. Stories began to spread of shadows pacing alongside hunters just out of sight. Some swore they felt watched at every moment, eyes tracking them through branches, footsteps echoing their own. They returned shaken, swearing never to go alone again. But even groups were not spared. Two hunters set out together one autumn morning, and neither returned. Their families searched for days, combing ridges and valleys, calling their names until voices cracked. They found a trail of prints pressed deep into the moss, massive and deliberate. The tracks circled the hunters' own, herding them like prey. Then they vanished, leaving no trace of where the men had been taken. It was not death that terrified them most. It was absence. The elders whispered that the hunters had broken some unspoken law, trespassing on land that belonged to something older. They warned that rifles and traps meant nothing against what lived in the wilderness. Younger men scoffed at first, but their laughter died when another vanished, leaving behind only a torn boot and claw marks etched into stone. Cabins grew quieter as wives lit lanterns through the night, waiting for footsteps that never came. Children clung to their mothers, asking why their fathers had not returned. No one answered. How could they explain that the forest itself had become an enemy? That the land no longer allowed its hunters to walk free? Search parties ventured deeper, but fear grew with every mile. They found trees bent low, bark stripped high above their heads, as if something massive had clawed at them in passing. They found bones buried shallow in moss, not chewed like a bear's kill, but cracked cleanly, split open as though drained. None of the remains matched the missing hunters. The hunters who survived grew restless. They gathered in the evenings, speaking in hushed tones, swearing they heard calls echoing in the distance. Not the calls of men, but something mimicking their voices, repeating words they had spoken only moments before. It was as though the forest itself mocked them, playing with their fear. One man confessed to seeing a figure in the trees, towering and broad, its outline blurred by mist. He aimed his rifle, but his hands shook so violently he never fired. He swore the figure grinned, teeth pale in the dark, before slipping silently away. The others dismissed his tale, but his eyes never lost their hollow look. Winter brought no safety. Snow only made the tracks more visible, sprawling across ridges where no man dared tread. Hunters tried following them once, but after miles of silence, they turned back, too afraid of what might wait at the end. The prints seemed to shift behind them, multiplying as if they were being stalked in return. Families pleaded for the hunting to stop, but hunger gnawed at their bellies. The forest gave food, and the forest took it away. Men entered the woods with prayers on their lips, muttered through clenched teeth. Each rifle shot that echoed back was a lifeline, proof that someone still lived. But too often, silence answered instead. The tally of missing grew until it was impossible to ignore. Fathers, sons, brothers, all gone. Their absence hollowed the settlement, leaving only shadows in their place. Children no longer played outside, too frightened of the tree line. Women spoke in whispers as if their words might carry too far and summon the thing that hunted them. A council was called, though no one knew what to decide. Abandon the settlement or stay and face what lingered in the woods. Some argued that leaving would anger it further, that it would follow them beyond the bay. Others swore leaving was the only chance to survive. The arguments went nowhere. Fear bound them tighter than any chain. Then came the night when 3 hunters vanished at once. They had left together, rifles ready, confident that their numbers offered safety. Their packs were found days later, torn open, supplies scattered like breadcrumbs. Their bodies were never recovered. Only claw marks etched deep into the frozen ground remained, reminders carved in ice. By then, the settlement was broken. Men refused to hunt, women refused to sleep, children cried through the night. The forest loomed closer each day, shadows creeping into the edges of their vision. It was no longer just wilderness. It was a predator waiting for its prey to collapse. And collapse they did. The last hunting party left in desperation, hoping to find answers rather than food. They carried lanterns, knives, and more rifles than they could hold. They promised their families they would return by dawn. Morning came, then another and another. But no one returned. The forest stood silent, offering nothing but the echo of its own stillness. Villagers whispered that the hunters had been claimed, not killed. That their voices were now among the whispers carried on the wind, calling from the trees. Some swore they heard them, faint and broken, begging for release. No one followed the sounds. No one dared. The forest did not give back what it had taken. By spring, the settlement had thinned to half its size. Hunger raged, but fear outweighed it. Few dared step beyond the cabins. Those who remained looked constantly to the tree line, waiting for the day the shadows would move closer. They no longer asked what had taken the hunters. They only asked when it would come for them too. Visitors years later found cabins collapsed and tools rusting where they had been left. Nets hung shredded. Rifles lay abandoned. No graves marked the missing hunters. No memorials stood in their names. Their stories were etched only in silence, carried by the land that had claimed them. The forest had swallowed them whole. The hunters of Port Chatham were not weak men. They were skilled, brave, and hardened by life in the wild. But bravery meant nothing against what stalked them. Their rifles, their knives, their knowledge, all useless. In the end, the hunters who never returned became the greatest warning of all, that the wilderness itself was not theirs to tame. Even now, whispers linger in the wind that sweeps across the bay. Travelers speak of hearing footsteps in the trees, too heavy, too deliberate, to be human. They swear they feel watched, as though eyes burn into their backs from the shadows. And some return with stories of voices calling from the dark, voices that sound like the hunters of old. Perhaps they still wander there, caught between worlds, their fate bound to the soil they once thought theirs. Or perhaps the forest simply remembers them, each disappearance etched into its roots, each scream woven into its branches. Either way, the truth remains. The hunters of Port Chatham left for the woods, and the woods never let them go. The cabins of Port Chatham once stood proud against the elements, their walls cut from spruce and cedar, roofs sealed with tar and moss. Smoke had once curled from chimneys, carrying the scent of fish stews and wood smoke into the air. Children had played along the paths between doors, laughter echoing in the valley, but those sounds were gone now. The cabin sat hollow, as though life had been ripped out in an instant. Inside, plates remained on tables, some still holding scraps of meals never finished. Cups tipped sideways, chairs overturned, as if families had risen suddenly and fled. Beds were unmade, blankets tangled, boots left by the door. It did not look like careful departure. It looked like panic frozen in wood and stone. The cabins had become snapshots of fear. Lanterns sat cold, their oil still half full. Bibles remained open on shelves, pages torn where desperate hands had gripped too tightly. Letters were scattered across floors, ink smudged by hurried fingers. Even toys remained, wooden horses, carved dolls, a ball of twine. It was as if time itself had stopped, unwilling to move past the moment terror struck. Those who ventured into the empty homes spoke of a presence still lingering. The air inside was heavier, colder than the air outside. Shadows stretched oddly against the walls, bending as though they had their own weight. Footsteps echoed faintly even when no one moved. The cabins were not just empty. They were haunted by what drove their owners away. One visitor claimed he saw claw marks raked across a doorframe, deep enough to splinter wood. Another found a cabin where the floorboards had been ripped upward from below, as though something had forced its way inside. The more they searched, the clearer it became. The people had not left willingly. They had been driven out or taken. At night, lantern light flickered in windows even though no one had lit them. Strangers swore they saw faint glows pulsing behind shutters, moving from room to room. Some thought the villagers had returned, spirits tied to the homes they had built. Others believed the thing that had chased them away now claimed the cabins as its lair. Either way, no one stayed long enough to be sure. The smell of rot lingered in some rooms, though no bodies were found. It was the sour stench of fear, of wood and cloth soaked through with terror. Some believed the cabins themselves had absorbed the panic of their inhabitants, holding onto it like a sponge. Every creak of timber sounded like a cry. Every gust of wind through cracks felt like a whisper. Abandoned belongings only deepened the unease. Coats hung by doors, stitched carefully for the cold, never taken on their final journeys. Tools rested by walls, axes, saws, knives, unused in their neat places. These were not the leavings of people who planned to return. They were the traces of those who fled too quickly to carry what they had built their lives upon. Travelers who camped nearby often reported waking in the night to sounds of doors slamming. Yet when they searched, the cabins stood closed, silent, undisturbed. Some swore they saw shapes moving inside, tall figures pacing through empty rooms. Their lanterns never revealed more than dust and decay, but their nerves told them otherwise. The cabins closest to the forest were the most disturbing. Their walls bore deep gouges, wood splintered outward, as if something had forced its way in. Roofs sagged under the weight of moss and snow, but the damage looked older, more violent. Whatever had come from the woods had not been stopped by locked doors. The families who lived there had no chance to escape. One cabin was found with its door hanging from broken hinges, swinging slowly in the wind. Inside, a table had been smashed to pieces, chairs reduced to splinters. A rifle leaned against the wall, fully loaded, never fired. That image struck the hardest. Whoever had lived there hadn't even managed to raise a hand in defense. The further one explored, the more it felt like the cabins had been abandoned in a single night. Food rotted in storage barrels, fish left salted but uncooked. Water buckets had frozen over, tools lay half repaired. There was no sign of packing, no sign of farewell, just emptiness, stark and immediate, as if the land itself had declared its ownership. Even the animals had fled. Chicken coops stood open, nests abandoned. Pens were broken, but not by storm, by desperate hooves and claws forcing their way out. The creatures had sensed the same fear as the humans, and they had run. In some cases, their bones were found not far from the cabins, gnawed clean. The predator had not spared them either. Legends grew quickly about the cabins. Locals from neighboring villages refused to enter them, calling them cursed. They claimed that anyone who slept inside would wake to find claw marks on their skin, or worse, never wake at all. Some said the houses whispered at night, creaking words and voices not their own. They became places of warning rather than shelter. Hunters who dared to stay overnight left in the morning, pale and hollow-eyed. They spoke of footsteps pacing outside their walls, of heavy breathing just beyond the door. Some claimed something had pressed against the windows, too large, too tall to belong to man. None of them stayed longer than one night. The cabins did not welcome the living. The objects left behind became eerie reminders of what was lost. A woman's shawl folded neatly on a chair, a child's drawing pinned to a wall, depicting figures with towering shadows behind them, a half-finished letter addressed to no one, its final words trailing off mid-sentence. Every artifact spoke of lives interrupted, of stories cut short. Explorers decades later still found the cabins unsettling. Even as moss overtook roofs and vines pried through windows, the silence inside remained sharp. No bird nested within, no animal sought shelter there. It was as if nature itself refused to reclaim what terror had marked. The cabins remained defiant ruins, standing against time. Some believed the families had left in too much haste to burn their homes, as settlers often did when abandoning a site. But others argued the cabins remained because they belonged not to the villagers anymore, but to whatever had claimed them. The houses were trophies, proof of conquest, left to decay in full view. One man recorded that, while examining a cabin, he heard laughter echoing faintly within. Not children's laughter, not human, something deeper, guttural, mocking. He fled without looking back, swearing never to set foot there again. His journal ended abruptly, the rest of the pages blank. The cabins became symbols of fear, spoken of in hushed voices. Travelers skirted them, giving the ruins wide berth. Even the bravest avoided their doors, as though crossing the threshold meant inviting the same fate. They stood as monuments, reminders that safety was a lie. Walls did not protect. Not here. Those who saw the cabins described a strange sensation, an impression that the homes themselves were watching. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, doors sagged like open mouths. In twilight, the effect was chilling, as though the village itself mourned its dead, or worse, as though it waited for new occupants to join them in silence. By the time Port Chatham was abandoned, the cabins had become more than structures. They were scars etched into the land as warnings. Each one carried its own story, its own echo of terror. They were not forgotten, for forgetting would mean risking the same fate, and so they remained, standing alone in the wilderness. Today, little more than ruins exist. Roofs have caved in, walls have collapsed, but the air inside still feels heavy. Travelers describe shivers running down their spines as they step across thresholds, a weight pressing against their chests. The cabins may be broken, but the fear woven into them endures. Even in decay, they tell their story. A settlement once filled with life, reduced to silence and shadows. Families who vanished without a trace, their homes left as hollow reminders. And though the wind and rain erode their walls, the message is clear: something hunted here, and the cabins remain its testament. The cabins abandoned in fear are more than relics. They are warnings carved into timber, whispers held in wood grain, echoes of panic that never faded. To enter them is to step back into the moment terror struck, a moment frozen forever, waiting for the next soul bold enough or foolish enough to listen. The forest around Port Chatham was no ordinary wilderness. Its trees stood like sentinels, ancient trunks twisting skyward, branches weaving together to blot out the light. Moss carpeted everything, muffling footsteps until silence clung to the air. Travelers said it felt less like walking through woods and more like entering a cathedral built by something that demanded reverence. Every glance over the shoulder carried the weight of being seen. Hunters had long believed the forest gave back what was offered: respect, patience, carefulness. But these woods twisted that balance. Men walked in carefully and never came out, as if the land had decided it no longer needed to share. Game was scarce, vanishing when it was most needed. And when prey did appear, it often led hunters deeper into the dark, almost like bait. Those who ventured far spoke of trees that bent strangely, bark peeled away as though scraped by massive claws. Sometimes entire groves grew silent. Not a bird, not an insect, daring to make a sound. The silence itself was suffocating, heavier than the fog that rolled from the bay. Men who returned told of the uncanny sense that something had matched their every step, hiding just beyond their vision. Lantern light offered little comfort. Flames sputtered in the forest, shrinking as if the darkness consumed them. The shadows cast by the trees stretched unnaturally long, curving and twisting until they resembled figures. Some swore those shadows shifted even when no one moved. The forest wasn't just a place, it was an audience, and it never stopped watching. One man described the sensation of eyes burning into the back of his neck. He spun, rifle raised, only to see trees swaying without wind. Yet as he turned again, he felt the weight of the stare move with him, always from behind, never from the front. By the time he stumbled out of the tree line, his nerves were so frayed he never set foot inside again. The animals, too, sensed it. Dogs balked at the edge of the forest, whining and planting their paws against the earth. Horses refused to pull wagons into the trees, kicking until harnesses snapped. Even the wild animals acted strangely, deer staring motionless, wolves circling without attacking, birds bursting into flight at once as though chased by something unseen. At night, the wilderness came alive with sounds no man could name. Roars rolled through valleys, low and guttural, too deep for bears, too sharp for wolves. Cracks echoed high in the branches, as though something massive moved from tree to tree. Sometimes there were footsteps, heavy, deliberate, thudding in rhythm, with a heart too large to belong to anything human. The fog made it worse. When it thickened, vision narrowed to a few feet. Men swore figures moved inside it, shapes taller than trees, silhouettes with long arms dragging along the ground. Yet when the mist parted, nothing stood there. The forest knew how to play with the eyes, how to keep fear sharp without ever revealing itself. Some hunters claimed the woods themselves shifted, trails twisted unexpectedly, familiar landmarks vanished, rivers ran in directions they hadn't before. It was as though the land rearranged itself to confuse intruders. Men who thought they knew the paths by heart found themselves wandering in circles, exhausted, their sense of direction shattered. The forest had no need to strike, it only had to wait. Stranger still were the voices. Some swore they heard companions calling their names, even when they were alone. Others heard whispers drifting between the trees, spoken in tones so low they were almost inaudible. The words never made sense, but the intent was clear. They were not meant to guide, but to lure. Men who followed the sounds often never returned. The trees bore scars of their own. Some trunks split down the middle, bark peeled back as though something massive had clawed its way free. Others had deep impressions, hand-like prints pressed into their wood. Entire groves tilted unnaturally, as if pushed by a strength no storm could carry. The wilderness was not passive, it bore marks of the thing that ruled it. One story told of hunters who built a fire in the forest to ward off the chill. As they sat, they noticed the glow of more fires around them, dozens of small flames flickering between trees. They thought other men had joined them, until they realized the fires were eyes, glowing, unblinking, fixed upon them. The hunters fled, abandoning everything. Their camp was found later, untouched. But they never were. The wilderness had a way of stripping men down, not just in body but in mind. Some returned rambling, their words broken, their thoughts scattered. They spoke of trees whispering secrets, of the ground pulsing like a heartbeat beneath their feet. They described hands reaching out from the soil, grabbing their ankles, though no marks showed. Fear itself had broken them. Explorers decades later entered with modern equipment, compasses, maps, lanterns stronger than before. Yet their tools betrayed them. Compasses spun wildly, maps became useless when trails shifted, and lanterns sputtered out for no reason. They too returned shaken, swearing the wilderness had eyes that saw deeper than instruments ever could. Those who lingered near the tree line long enough often felt dread seep into their bones. Not panic, not sudden terror, but a slow suffocation, as though the forest wanted to erode them piece by piece. They would retreat eventually, breathless, feeling lighter once they reached open ground. None doubted then that the woods themselves had a will. The cabins at the edge of the forest told their own story. Their walls leaned toward the trees, their roofs sagging as if drawn by unseen hands. Windows gaped wide, staring into the wilderness like empty eyes. It felt as though the forest was reclaiming them, not with moss and rot, but with intent, pulling them closer each year. Some men tried to fight back. They cut trees in wide swaths, clearing paths and burning brush. But their victories never lasted. The forest grew back quickly, unnaturally so, saplings sprouting in days, branches tangling faster than hands could clear them. The wilderness did not tolerate scars. It healed itself, stronger than before. There were nights when the watching was unmistakable. Men swore they saw shapes between the trees, broad shoulders, heads brushing the branches. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting firelight like predators. Yet whenever lanterns were turned directly toward them, the shapes melted away, leaving nothing but silence. The fear was not of being attacked, it was of being studied. Elders in nearby villages warned that the forest was alive in ways men could not understand. They spoke of spirits older than memory, bound to the land by blood spilled upon it. To enter without permission was to trespass, and the punishment was always the same: disappearance. The wilderness did not kill quickly. It simply took. The sounds grew worse in winter. Cracks thundered through frozen valleys, groans like wood splitting, but deeper, as though mountains themselves shifted. Tracks appeared in snow, massive, winding into trees where no man could follow. Some were fresh, steaming faintly in the cold air, as though the creature that left them had only just passed. Travelers who braved the wilderness after the settlement's fall returned with stories too consistent to ignore. They spoke of the sensation of walking not into a forest, but into an arena. Every rustle, every snapped twig, every breath was weighed, measured, judged. The wilderness wasn't simply watching, it was deciding who belonged and who did not. Even those who never entered the woods felt it. Standing on the shoreline, staring into the tree line, villagers said the forest stared back. It was not imagination, it was instinct, the primal awareness of prey under a predator's gaze. Few could resist turning away, retreating to the open air where the eyes of the wilderness could not reach. Over time, the trees overtook the abandoned settlement, creeping closer each year. Paths vanished under roots. Walls were swallowed by ivy. Roofs collapsed under the weight of branches. It was as though the wilderness had always intended to claim the village, watching patiently until the moment arrived. Now no trace of the settlement remained, except whispers of its fate. The wilderness of Port Chatham remains to this day, untouched, avoided. Travelers who dare to enter still speak of the sensation of eyes following their every move, unseen but undeniable. No evidence proves the stories, but the fear itself is proof enough. For those who walk there, understand quickly, the forest does not forget. And those who linger too long realize a deeper truth. The wilderness of Port Chatham is not just alive, it is aware, it has always been watching. And when it chooses to, it will reach out once more, claiming those bold enough or foolish enough to step inside. Port Chatham was once marked on maps with certainty, a dot on Alaska's southern coast, promising opportunity. Fishermen came for the rich waters, loggers for the endless trees, and families for the hope of community in a land that demanded strength. For a time, the settlement grew, its name whispered with pride by those who called it home. Yet in a matter of years, it slipped into obscurity, erased more by silence than time. Historians piecing through records found only fragments. A census here, a trade note there, the faint outlines of a village meant to prosper. But alongside those traces came reports of fear, letters unfinished, journals that broke off mid-entry, accounts of men vanishing without explanation. The story of Port Chatham was not one of steady decline, but of abrupt abandonment. The official accounts were sparse, often dismissive. Bureaucrats claimed harsh winters, poor soil, or economic failure had driven people away, yet the details did not align. Tools had been left behind, cabins abandoned mid-task, fishing nets still strung along posts. A slow decline left traces of planning. What Port Chatham left behind was the mark of flight. Whispers of what caused that flight remained alive in oral traditions. Villagers in neighboring towns spoke of screams carried on the wind, of shadows moving across the tree line where none should be. Hunters who crossed too close reported strange tracks in the snow, impressions larger than any man's, vanishing into the forest without end. These stories were not written down, but they endured longer than the settlement itself. Decades passed, and the place disappeared from new maps. Sailors avoided the bay, claiming their compasses spun wildly near its waters. Fishermen steered wide, muttering of cursed currents and unseen watchers in the fog. Even as other towns thrived along the Alaskan coast, Port Chatham's name fell away, erased like chalk from a slate. Explorers returned in later years, drawn by curiosity more than necessity. They found collapsed cabins and moss-covered paths, evidence of a life once lived. Yet what struck them most was the atmosphere, an oppressive silence that lingered even in daylight. They wrote of a place where history itself seemed reluctant to speak, as if the land wished to keep its secrets buried. Some believed the erasure was deliberate. Stories circulated of officials who discouraged further settlement, claiming dangers too great to risk. Files disappeared from archives, reports marked inconclusive or not for public release. What was left in public record told little, leaving gaps too wide for simple oversight. To some, it felt as if Port Chatham had been covered up, not forgotten. Still, the stories spread, whispered around fires in distant villages. Parents warned children never to wander into the forest near the bay. Elders told of hunters who never returned, their cries echoing through the trees long after their bodies were gone. The wilderness was patient, they said, and Port Chatham was proof of its hunger. Adventurers who sought to disprove the legends often returned, shaken. They spoke of hearing footsteps that matched their own, of low growls vibrating through the earth, of shapes glimpsed in the fog, only to vanish when approached. Some fled after a single night, abandoning equipment rather than endure another. The ruins remained, but no one dared stay long. What remained of Port Chatham became less a place and more a story. Its mark on history was etched not in monuments or records, but in warnings. It was spoken of as an example of how swiftly civilization could vanish when confronted by forces beyond its control. The lesson was not in its founding, but in its end. Legends of creatures tied to the bay spread beyond Alaska. Bigfoot enthusiasts claimed the missing hunters and families had been victims of a cryptid older than myth. Skeptics dismissed the tales as folklore born of fear and isolation. Yet even the skeptics struggled to explain the consistency of the accounts, repeated generation after generation with eerie similarity. For the families of those who once lived there, closure never came. They had no graves to mourn, no markers to visit. Their loved ones simply vanished into the silence, leaving only shadows of memory. The absence itself became a legacy, a wound that echoed through descendants who still wondered why Port Chatham had been abandoned. The wilderness reclaimed the land, yet even in ruin, the place resisted obscurity. Travelers who stumbled upon the site described an aura that set it apart from other abandoned settlements. The cabins sagged under moss, the docks rotted into the tide, but the weight of fear lingered, etched into the very air. History could not erase what the land refused to release. Maps today still skirt the name, leaving only blank space where a community once stood. The erasure itself draws more attention than remembrance ever could. To erase something completely is to admit it mattered, and so Port Chatham lives on in absence, its blank space screaming louder than any written word. The story seeped into popular culture, carried by whispers, books, and documentaries. Each retelling reshaped the details, but the core remained the same, an entire settlement gone without trace, leaving behind stories of something in the dark. The mystery gave it immortality, its vanishing becoming its defining mark on history. Some researchers argue the people of Port Chatham became a warning symbol not just for Alaska, but for all who settled in wild places. Their story reminded settlers that nature could not always be conquered, that there were places where humanity's reach was unwelcome. The vanishing was not simply tragedy, it was testament. Even skeptics admit the unsettling truth. Other settlements fell to fire, famine, or war, but they left evidence. Port Chatham left only silence. No bones, no graves, no mass exodus recorded. Just empty homes, frozen meals, and the suggestion that something had taken them swiftly and without mercy. That is what makes it unforgettable. The mark of Port Chatham lies not in what is known, but in what will never be explained. Its absence fuels the imagination, ensuring its story outlives facts. To this day, those who speak of it find themselves glancing at shadows, lowering their voices as though the wilderness might still be listening. Tourists who visit the bay describe unease before they even reach shore. Boats creak louder, the air grows heavier, and compasses falter. When they set foot on land, silence grips them instantly. Even without knowing its history, they sense it. The place carries its story in the air itself, refusing to let time erase what happened there. Some say this is the true mark Port Chatham left. Fear that outlasts memory, fear that seeps into strangers who never lived there, who never knew the families who vanished, fear that binds people across generations, whispering the same warning again and again: some places are not meant for us. And so Port Chatham endures, not in the pages of history books, not on official maps, but in the minds of all who hear its name. Its vanishing is its monument, its silence, its story. It remains an unanswered question carved into Alaska's wild coast, where the sea and the forests still guard what they claimed. Even now, when the fog drifts low across the bay, locals swear they hear echoes. Voices faint as whispers, laughter turned hollow, screams carried by the wind. Whether those sounds are tricks of nature or remnants of the past, no one knows, but they are reminders that Port Chatham's story did not end. It waits. The true vanishing mark of Port Chatham is this: it cannot be forgotten. To erase it is to invite curiosity, and to remember it is to feel fear. The settlement is gone, but its absence is louder than its presence ever was. That is how it carved itself into history, not as a town that thrived, but as one that disappeared into shadow. Today, Port Chatham sits in silence, its cabins swallowed by moss and its docks splintered by the tide. Fishermen steer clear, hunters won't set foot there, and even the bravest locals call it cursed. What drove an entire town to vanish was never proven, but the stories of roars in the dark and the trail of bodies remain impossible to ignore. Whether it was myth or monster, the wilderness claimed its people and left behind a place so feared, even time refuses to reclaim it.